like Brett said, my name's Morgan, and I am a Conservation Leadership Through Learning 5.0 student. And this morning I'm going to be talking to you all about the time I spent working with the Grevy Zebra Trust in Samburu, Kenya. So on the agenda for today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Samburu as a place, give you some context to where we are working. I'm going to talk to you about the Grevy Zebra, which is kind of at the focus of our story today. And I'll talk to you about the importance of youth engagement and involvement in conservation programming. Finally, at the end, I'll wrap up with some of the most valuable lessons that I learned during my time abroad. So Samburu is located in the northern part of Kenya. It's indicated here on this map by the little blue star. It's occupied primarily by people who identify with the Samburu tribe. And historically, the Samburu people were pastoralists, and they moved all around the region. Today, people live a more sedentary lifestyle, but they still own large herds of animals. And these herds of animals provide not only a livelihood for the people, so these are like goats, cows, camels, etc., but they also represent wealth and status in the community. The Samburu people and their livestock share the landscape with two large national reserves, Buffalo Springs and Samburu National Reserve, which are home to a whole bunch of different kinds of animals, including some endemic species like the garnet. They're the long-necked antelope. And additionally, they're home to the endangered Grevy zebra. So the Grevy zebra is a large zebra. They're a little different than the plain zebra. They're bigger, they've got these cute round ears, and their stripes don't go all the way under their bellies. They're also considered one of the most endangered large land mammals in Africa. Historically, their range spanned the Horn of Africa, but today they're considered locally extinct in all of those countries, with their only population being found in northern Kenya, which has 93% of their population, and then there's 3 small pockets left in Ethiopia. The Kenyan Wildlife Service, or KWS, has identified 4 big threats to the grevies. These would be large-scale habitat loss, struggle getting access to water frequently and seasonally, an increased frequency and severity in drought, and then a spread of disease as disease works its way through these animals incredibly quickly. These grevies were found in Samburu National Reserve, and they were actually identified by the team at Grevy Zebra Trust, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, to be undernourished, and that's a sign of the fact that they're unhealthy, especially that early into the dry season. In addition to these threats, the Grevy zebra is a really shy animal, and it's dissuaded from using land when there's people or livestock nearby. This is an issue because they share this landscape with the Samburu people and their livestock. Now, it doesn't really come as a surprise, but zebras need the same kind of thing as cows and goats. They're all looking for grass and they're all looking for water. So when the herders are taking their animals to the best forage spots and the best watering holes, they're pushing the zebras out. So in 2007, the Grevy Zebra Trust came onto the scene. They're located in Westgate Community Conservancy, which is located just outside of the Samburu National Reserve. And in that community conservancy, there are 8 zones. The Grevy Zebra Trust works to conserve the Grevy's habitat in partnership with the local communities. And that's their big thing, is they're working through community partnerships to empower the people in their community. They provide lots of different opportunities for community members to be involved. Some of these include employment opportunities through their Scout program, Warrior program, and Ambassador program. These 3 programs are kind of the hallmark of Grevy's work. They provide opportunities for the communities to get involved with Grevy's conservation, and they also make the matter personal. In addition to really bringing that personal message home, they build trust and rapport with the communities. The organization is there working, and they're building a relationship on the ground. In this picture, one of the scouts who works for Grevy Zebra is speaking to the children who participated in the field school, which we'll get more in depth on in a moment. In addition to employment opportunities, Grevy Zebra Trust spearheads water improvement projects and rangeland restoration projects. These projects clearly target those issues that are threatening the Grevy zebra: a lack of water, a lack of fresh rangeland, but they also help the pastoralists and their livestock, because again, the livestock needs the same resources as the grevies. Finally, there's community outreach meetings where they work with the elders in the community and some of the other local adults, and then they work with the youth through engagement at the schools. The twist here is not all the kids in Westgate go to school. There's a large population of children who spend almost every day of the year out on the rangeland with their family's animals. And these children are called herders until they reach a certain age, where they become moran, which are the male warriors, or they integrate into the community in a more traditional role as females. So Grevy Zebra Trust recognizes that they have a gap in their youth outreach strategy, and they say, what do we do about this? And they turn around and they develop the Conservation Field School. The Conservation Field School targeted both school children and herder children from the 8 zones in Westgate. And additionally, they were counting on the knowledge that the school children would bring to the table and the knowledge that the herder children had from being on the landscape to help the kids learn from each other. So the Conservation Field School is where I come in. The Conservation Field School took place over the course of a week, and they had these 9 key learning objectives, which GZT established before the program started. They addressed these objectives through a variety of lessons taught in both lecture-style formatting and then also through games and some creative outreach time. Additionally, there were field trips into Samburu National Reserve, which took the form of a game drive, and out to a buffer zone, which we piled all the kids in the car and went out to this buffer zone where they had done a bunch of rehab and talked about the importance of restoration projects on the landscape. There were 32 children who participated in the field school, and these children were split evenly by gender, their education, and the zones that they came from. The school children were chosen by their teachers and were targeted because they hadn't been exposed to other conservation programs happening on the landscape. Grevy's isn't the only nonprofit working out there. They share the landscape with Owasso Lions and Save the Elephants, who target lion conservation and elephant conservation. The herders were chosen by the elders in their community as being natural leaders who could take those lessons that they were learning back to their communities. So here I have for you the 9 learning objectives, which you can scan through, but essentially what they were looking at was how do we help the kids understand the interconnectedness and the interrelationships on the landscape. These were their big target areas, and they were working on livestock impact, the water cycle, key grasses and perennial species, and additionally, what is the value of the grevy's? Why do we need the kids to care about that? They also wanted the kids to leave understanding what they could do to make a difference. So the big question at this point, you've got programming, you've got kids, you've got an endangered zebra that needs some help, you've got a plan. You need to know if the participants who worked in your program actually learned anything. So before I can answer that question for you, I want to tell you how we determined whether or not the kids learned anything. And like I said, the Conservation Field School is really where I come into this program. The 8 of us who were over in Kenya started this project as a group project, and then it took off and became kind of my project, which was really exciting. But essentially what we looked to do was to develop an assessment, a tool of sorts, that could gauge the knowledge the kids had coming into the field school program and the knowledge that they had as they left it. It was a 2-part assessment that we used photo cards for, and I have with me today some of the cards that we used. So we used these photo cards, and we did it before the test and after the test, and I'm going to talk you through that in just a moment. But we scored parts of the test, and those scores were based on these connections that the kids would be making. So we'll talk through that. So to begin, we played a bunch of icebreakers to get the kids comfortable with each other and to get the kids comfortable with the staff at GZT and with myself and Travis, who's here today, who helped collect data. And we made a point to frame this assessment as a game. We didn't want the kids to feel like this was a test that would be impacting their life or impacting their future. And we didn't want them to feel like there was the potential of a right answer or a wrong answer. Really what we were looking for was, what did the children understand? So the first part of the assessment, we went through these cards with the kids, and we asked them the simple question of, what is this? So showing the kids practice cards, this was one of them. You say, what is this? And they tell you it's a baboon. The quick response to those questions was important because for the first part, we weren't taking scores. We just wanted to know what they were seeing. So we went through several. So this, hopefully they would say, was a giraffe and an elephant. And then we got into pictures that captured different parts of their landscape. So for instance, we had some children identify this image as a road, other children identify it as a dry riverbed, other children identify it as rocks. Didn't really matter what the children identified it as long as then later when they were making their connections, they had consistency in what they were using it for. So the second part of the test, and I'll pass these around, you guys can look through them if you want. The second part of the test, we laid these cards out on a table or the ground in front of the kids, and we asked the children one by one to go through and make connections. The connections that we were looking for were things like, how do you relate these images to each other? And the example we gave the children was, what is this picture? And they would tell you it's a bird, and they had identified this as a cow. And you'd say, the bird sits on the back of the cow, and it eats the bugs, and that's how they're connected. So you show the kids that example, and then you ask them to go through and make as many connections as they can, using as many cards as they want. And the assessment ended when the children declared themselves finished.
You're done.
They weren't. They were looking at it like, I don't see any more. Thanks for playing. You did great. It was great. And so we did that individually for all 32 children. We'd broken them into testing teams of 3. There were 3 English-speaking proctors and then 3 people who spoke the local language, which is Ma, or as they call it over there. They refer to it as Samburu. So we administered the assessment, and then we had to score it. So talking about scoring, things get a little more complicated because you have kids making these connections, and you don't want to gauge them as right or wrong because you're looking to see what they understand. So we broke the scoring into 3 categories. To start, we had basic connections, which we didn't assign any points to, and those were kind of common sense things that anyone living on the Samburu landscape would know. So an example of that would be something like, this picture is the lions, and the lions eats, and it could have been the zebra or the goats or the cows, but essentially just saying lions eat other animals, because they do. Level 1 connections were slightly more advanced. They showed a higher level of thinking, but that level of thinking that they were demonstrating didn't necessarily relate to the GZT curriculum. So an example of a question like that is they may have picked this card, which is a picture of children, this card, which is a picture of the grevies, this card, which is a picture of the lions, and this card, which is a picture of a healthy rangeland, but a lot of kids identified it as a reserve. And they might say, tourists come to the reserve to see lions and zebras, and then school children get money from conservation fees to go to school. That indicates a higher level of understanding about how things are working on their landscape, but again, it doesn't relate to those key learning objectives established by GZT. So we wanted to recognize that higher level of thinking, but also recognize that it wasn't at the heart and soul of the programming. Finally, we had our level 2 connections, and if you couldn't already guess, those related to the GZT curriculum. So a level 2 connection was something that the children made, a connection that the children made that directly related to what was being taught. So one example of a level 2 connection might be children using the picture of the clouds, this picture where it's raining, that captures runoff, rain coming out of the sky, however they chose to interpret it. And then this picture, which has a river with water in it, saying, when it rains, when the clouds get heavy with rain, it comes out of the sky and feeds into the river, and then it will evaporate back into the clouds. That demonstrates a clear understanding of the water cycle. And the water cycle on their local landscape was one of the biggest things that GZT was looking at. Another example might be the children would take the image of the cow, the image of the rangeland, and say the cow's host can benefit the rangeland because as they trample the soil, it turns and introduces air and helps hold water, and additionally, the cows have dung and urine, and that fertilizes the soil. That came directly from a GZT lesson, and the kids clearly retained some information there. So those were our level 2 connections. And we said that an increase in score would also would indicate an increase in understanding of the topics at hand. Because in theory, if the kids are understanding what's being taught to them, they're going to be making more of those level 2 connections. So was there a change? Did we see that? Yeah, we did. 78% of the children who participated in the conservation field school saw an increase in their final score. So for this next part, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about where we saw some of those increases, some of the demographics we saw those increases in and that we looked at specifically, and some of the things to consider when you're looking at this. So we'll start with the group results. And before I click to the next slide, I just want to let you know that all of the percentages on the slides come from that whole number of participants. So 32 is our 100%. Additionally, there's numbers in parentheses, and those numbers indicate the number of children who make up that percentage. So we'll start with our group results. Like I just said, we saw 78% of children see an increase in their final score, which to us indicated an increase in understanding of the concepts. When we talk about the number of connections made and an increase in score, for 47% of the kids, that's the correlation. You see 47% increase the number of connections they're making, and in addition to that, they increase their score. But it's worth noting that for 28% of the kids who participated in the field school program, they actually decreased the number of connections they made, but still saw an increase in their score. So that told us as we were looking through the data that those children might be making less connections, but they could be taking some of the connections they came in with and making them higher level. So you still see that increase in knowledge. And for every increase, of course, you have to talk about the decreases as well. And for 22% of the children who participated, there was either a decrease in score or no change in score. I'll tell you that 15%, it was a no change. And 3 of those 5 kids that make up that 15% still increased the number of connections they made. But those connections were all in the basic level, so they didn't see any change in their score. So looking at that on an individual level, you can say, well, children X increased from 0 connections to 3 connections. So we would like to think that they learned a little bit, or they retained a little bit, but they didn't make any of those higher level connections. And then finally, we saw 2 children who saw both a decrease in the number of connections they made and a decrease in their score. So now that we've kind of talked about the overall group results, I'm going to go into results that relate to gender, so male versus female, and education, herder versus school children. After we talk about those different demographics, I'm going to tell you about the areas that we saw the most growth in, so those taking it back to those key learning objectives as established by GZT. So we'll start with our gender comparisons. Overall, the males had 13 who showed, so remember there's 16 males, 16 females. 13 of the males showed an increase in their score, 2 saw the decrease in their score, and then 1 saw no change. I want to talk a little bit about their pre-assessment scores and their post-assessment scores, but what I really want to draw your attention to is the differences in the level 1 connections and the level 2 connections. So up there you can see they have the total number of connections, and in the pre-assessment the males made 182 total connections, and of those 182, 48 were what we called higher level, so those level 1 and level 2 connections that were worth those points. Of the 48, 36 were level 1, and that number actually decreased in the post-assessment. So you see the level 1 connections don't change very dramatically, and you see that in almost all the populations except the females, so we'll get to in a second. But then you look at the level 2 connections, and you see that they went from 12 of those connections that meet the GZT standards that relate to that curriculum, so they came in knowing some things. But they took those connections to 65 in the post-assessment, which then took their final score from 60 to 160. So again, the level 2 connections were worth 2 points apiece, and so you see that the majority of their score comes from those connections made. The females, on the other hand, we saw 12 who increased their score, and then 4 who didn't see a change in their score. And again, they started with a decent number of total connections, 168. Only 28 of those were considered higher level, though. And of those 28, 25 were level 1. So they had a good understanding of the landscape around them, but didn't demonstrate a lot of understanding for the topics that GZT was covering. Those level 2 connections, the females started out with only 3 in the pre-assessment. In the post-assessment, they took that 3 and turned it into 30, which is notable and huge. And as a result, their score went from 31 in the pre-assessment to 101 in the post-assessment. So we can recognize by looking at the number of level 1 connections that the males and females came in with that there is some understanding of the landscape around them. And judging solely by this assessment, it looks like the males demonstrated a higher level of knowledge, which would indicate that maybe they had a higher baseline coming in. And this becomes important when we talk about suggestions for the future. However, we recognize that both groups saw an increase in understanding of topics and made growth in their own ways. These second bars over here are the post-assessment. And so these are your post-assessment scores, male and female, and you see a growth in connections for both groups and a growth in scores. So that's notable and important to recognize. So when we move into the herder and the school children scores, you see something that almost mirrors that. The school-going children, again, like similarly to the males, seem to have come in with a higher number of level 1 connections and then increase their connections significantly in the post-assessment. So we'll talk through that really quick. The school-going children, 15 increased their score and 1 decreased their score. And in their pre-assessment, they made 218 connections. Those connections increased to 246 in the post-assessment, but where you see the most growth is in those higher level connections. Again, they took their level 2 scores up significantly. The school children only made 7 level 2 connections in the pre-assessment, and they took that to 56 in the post. So their score then went from 55 to 161. The herders, on the other hand, we had 10 increase their score, 1 decrease their score, and 5 who saw no change in their score. Their level 2 connections went from 8 to 39. So they still saw a notable increase, but their increase was nowhere near as notable as the school children's. And again, we can say that there are some factors that play into this, which we'll address more as we get deeper in for suggestions in the future. But I would just say right off the bat that I think a lot of that has to do with the lecture style learning that was present in the field school. The school children are used to going in, they're used to sitting in a classroom. That's a very normal way for them to learn. As I said earlier, the herder children are spending their days out on the landscape with their family stock. So that's an important thing to consider. However, it is still a notable increase in level 2 connections and a notable increase in their overall score. Finally, we looked at the different zones. There were 8 zones represented, which make up the Westgate community, and some of those zones had elders who were present throughout the week. We were interested to see if there was any appreciable difference between the various zones, and there wasn't. All of the zones saw an increase in their level 2 connections and an increase in their overall score. 2 zones did see an increase in the number of level 1 connections they made, but we would also suggest that because there were only 4 children from each zone, that outliers and the outliers can heavily influence the data set, but also 4 kids isn't a big enough sample size to really gauge an understanding of how the zones did. But it was exciting to see that all of the zones were represented in their growth. So now I'll talk to you about the areas that we saw that growth. I keep saying there was growth, there was growth, there was growth, and that's great, and those level 2 connections grew, and that's also great. But where did we see that growth? Because there are 9 objectives, and is it realistic that all of them grew? That would be a perfect world, and most of them grew, but this is where we saw the most. So children's ability to talk about their local water cycle was one of the biggest things we saw. In the pre-assessment, a lot of children used this image and this image alone to talk about water and rain on their landscape. It's clouds, and the kids recognized the clouds come and the rains come, and that was about the extent of where they got with that. In the post-assessment, though, we had kids making those level 2 connections, like I demonstrated earlier. The rains come and they get heavy, and the rain falls and it lands on the landscape. And from there, you had kids talking about runoff, the importance of ground cover, the importance of trees and holding water on their landscape. And then from that point, you talked about where does the runoff go? Well, it goes into the groundwater, and kids could tell you that, or it goes into the rivers. And after it's entered the groundwater or the rivers, it'll evaporate back up into the clouds. So that was a notable thing that we saw in the post-assessment. Another huge topic that GZT drove home was the importance of planned and rotational grazing and leaving recovery time for plants. In the cards I passed around, there were 2 pictures of grasses. They were numbers 10 and 11, and they looked pretty similar, but one was in shabbier shape than the other. That card represented an overgrazed grass, the shabbier card, number 11, was less healthy grass that had been overgrazed. Number 10 was healthier grass that had been grazed and should probably not be eaten anymore. In the post-assessment, kids started to recognize that. They would point to one and say, this plant's been overgrazed, but we left recovery time for this plant. And that right there really showed that they understood the importance of leaving time for the plants to recover and continue to grow. Additionally, the children started recognizing this image as more than just a grassland. It was, in the pre-assessment, it was things like, it's a park, it's a farm, it's a private conservancy. It was recognized as a landscape that they could not access. It was recognized as grasses that they could not have. GCT provided this image, and it comes from a zone that they work in frequently. It's not a private property. It's not something the kids don't have access to. It's just not something they're familiar with. In the post-assessment, though, they started recognizing this as a landscape that was attainable. They would use the image of a degraded landscape, which you guys have out there, the image of a degraded landscape, and they would say, this landscape is unhealthy, and we can make it look like this landscape by using our livestock. We can make buffer zones. We can use the bunching of goats and the bunching of cows to turn up the soil and to really help production of grass. And so that was exciting, and they also recognized that they could make a difference in the health of the rangeland, which was huge. That's one of the biggest things Grevy Zebra Trust was pushing for. Additionally, they recognized the valuable relationship that their livestock has with the land. So I've told you a couple times about the importance of the hose and the soil turning, but they also recognize that they can use the land throughout the whole year to benefit their livestock. There was conversations in the post-assessment using images of a boma, which is that big, it's made out of acacias, it's a circle in the cards, that they can either use to keep livestock in or keep livestock out, and talking about the importance of having corridors and areas that they don't use during the rainy season, that then they can use during the dry season, that are healthier and they can bring their animals back to. And finally, one of the most interesting shifts in understanding that we saw was the relationship between predators, prey, and the rangeland. So we had an image of lions that the children used, and in the pre-assessment, these lions were connected to this rangeland 4 times. And those connections were generally things like the lions can camouflage in the rangeland, or the lions have their babies in the grass. In the post-assessment, it was the 3rd most made connection with 26 different mentions. And those mentions began to include the lions are important to the health of the rangeland because they chase animals across it, and those animals have hoof action that turns the soil. Or the lions are important to the rangeland because the lions eat things and leave those decomposing carcasses to break down into the ground. A lot of their understanding of the relationship between the importance of predators on the landscape came from a video they watched on Masamara, which is one of the large reserves in Kenya, and also came from a variety of games and different case studies that the GZT staff shared with them. And one other connection that was made frequently in both the pre and post assessment was the importance of the rangeland to the Grevy zebra. So the children recognized that the zebra needs the grasses. That was the 2nd most made connection in the pre-assessment and the post-assessment. The most made connection in both the pre and post-assessment was that their livestock needs the grasses. So they recognize that the animals need to share the range with the wildlife. In the pre-assessment, this connection was only made 18 times. It was mentioned in 18 different connections, but in the post-assessment, it was mentioned 36 times. So those were our big areas where we definitely saw the most increase in knowledge, which was exciting and fun to see. So finally, I want to talk to you about some of the recommendations that we have for the future of the field school, and I want to focus a little bit on the value of engaging youth in conservation education. We're playing a game. He's a lion in that picture. It's one of my favorites. And games are where we'll start. One of the most important things for the Grevy Zebra Trust to consider as they move forward with their conservation field school is the importance of interactive and experiential learning tools. The water cycle, the impact of animals on the rangeland, the value of predators on the rangeland, all of those things had games incorporated into their lessons. They were a lecture with a peer teaching opportunity, with a game in the morning to remind them of what they had learned the day before. And then there was the video, which was so exciting for some of these kids to get to watch a video. And those things really sent those messages home. There were some areas that didn't use things like that. One example is we had the grazing committee, which is a group of elders from the Westgate area, come and talk to the kids. And that was a day of conversation. It was a day of learning so much of incredible knowledge about the history of the landscape, what animals were there previously, what animals weren't, and then what happened, how did that change? the kids didn't really reflect a lot of that information. The things they seemed to retain were the things that they had these great hands-on interactive experiences with. So that's one of the biggest things that we would suggest for the Grevy Zebra Trust. In this image here, again, you have kids playing a game. They're practicing being wildebeest after they had learned about the Maasai migration, and they're bunching together for safety to stay away from the lions. Their hoofs are turning the soil as well. Another thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to some of the programming is bring it back to that gender conversation. So as we saw in the scores, the males seem to come in with a slightly higher baseline than the females, and as a result, they also seem to grasp some of the concepts more. In the Samburu culture, it is very common that a male's education is prioritized over a female's, and that's something that's changing, but some would say not quickly enough. There were 8 girls who were going to school who represented the female side of the school program, but we would suggest integrating single gender programming into a couple of the lessons. These kids are also middle school aged. Middle schoolers are learning about the other gender. They're worried about what their peers might think. So taking the gender norms that exist in the Samburu culture and then taking just the natural age of middle schoolers and combining those things can leave some room for kids to question themselves and question what they're talking about. I would suggest that if you separate males and females for some of the programming, it gives kids an opportunity to speak freely without worrying about, oh, well, that boy might think it's a dumb question, or, oh, no, that girl doesn't think I know enough. And then you can bring the kids back together and have them teach one another. And peer learning opportunities and peer teaching opportunities are a great way to enforce information. Going along with the trend of peer learning and teaching opportunities, it's important to remember that part of the reason we brought school children and herder children together is because of their different backgrounds. When Grevy Zebra established the form for the field school, they were specific and excited about the school children understanding things from the national curriculum that they could bring into the lessons and into the conversations, and the herder children who knew things about being on the landscape. They were there every day. They were seeing the changes with their own eyes. However, there weren't a lot of opportunities for the kids to share those experiences during the field school week. In this image, we have a child who we did a project during the creative hour where we had the kids draw healthy rangelands and unhealthy rangelands and then the water cycle and explain to their peers what they had drawn and why. This boy, Steven, is explaining a healthy rangeland. He's got water that stayed on the rangeland, there's a large number of animals on the rangeland, and there's healthy trees and everything looks great. The image that the kids drew of an unhealthy rangeland had a lot of brown, it had a lot of gullies, and very few trees or animals. So giving kids an opportunity to talk to each other about what they know and what they've been learning is going to enforce confidence and some of the lessons that they've been taught. Additionally, after this year, they have an alumni group. They have kids who've participated in the field school previously. These 32 kids went back to their individual communities and they brought the lessons they learned with them. They're also on the ground seeing things that the Grevy Zebra staff isn't keeping up with. We're going to talk about how GZT is going to continue to engage those children in just a second, but we would also suggest that it's important to bring those kids back to teach each other and to share the lessons with the next batch of conservation field school participants that they found to be most important. So if they took a lot out of the lesson on bunching your goats and how to herd and what low impact herding looks like, have them come back and help teach that. Why not? That's a great way to keep those kids engaged and involved, instill confidence and leadership skills, and show the kids who are participating in the program that the lessons are important. They clearly matter to their peers 1 year, 2 years ago. Additionally, the integration of an awareness building objective. This is the logo for the Westgate Community Conservancy. Westgate Community Conservancy is this kind of governing body over these 8 different zones and the communities. They make decisions on resource management, on where land projects are happening, and they work closely with the conservation partners on the ground. I want to talk about Westgate and their logo because in both the pre and post assessment, there was a distinct failure among the children to recognize it as the logo for Westgate. The kids who were literate and could read oftentimes identified the image by looking at it and reading it. And they would read Westgate Community Conservancy and then the Samburu text. And they would say, it says this. And that was their interpretation of the image. Kids who weren't literate would oftentimes identify it as a picture of historical warriors, so these two guys here, or just another zebra, clearly in the middle. When this image was used in connections, it was used by taking the image of the warriors and saying, well, these warriors protect the zebra, and the warriors with their livestock are protecting their livestock. Or it would say, the zebra in that picture can find company and companionship with the zebras in this picture. But again, there was no real recognition of the conservancy as itself. There was one exception to that, and that was in the post-assessment, where a child read the name, and you could see the kind of click. It was like, oh, Westgate, I've heard that word before. And then they went on to say that if they were out with their livestock and they found a dead grevy zebra, they could report it to the people at Westgate. However, in the post-assessment, we still had lots of kids who identified this image as a road sign directing you to Samburu National Reserve, which it definitely isn't. They also would identify it as the Grevy Zebra Trust logo, or they would identify it as something that was just a sign or an image, and they'd seen it out and about, but they didn't understand what it meant or what it represented. Westgate is not the only organization on the landscape. As I said earlier, there's a gamut of conservation organizations working out there. To have the children who are growing up and who will one day be the future leaders of their community not recognize their governing body is a serious thing to talk about, because you want these kids to grow up knowing that they have the opportunity to work in partnership with not only Westgate Community Conservancy, but with Grevy Zebra Trust, with Owasso Lions, with Save the Elephants. And so I would suggest that Grevy Zebra could help spread that knowledge and help address those concerns through an awareness building objective. Additionally, it's important to remember that sometimes you have to adapt to your surroundings. Things aren't always going to be the same, and there's not always going to be what worked 1 year might not work in 5 years. So it's important to encourage the Grevy Zebra Trust to remember to adaptively program. The needs of the communities are going to change. The needs of the species are going to change. Who knows? The Grevy zebra might start to rebound. It is. We're seeing an increase in numbers. There might be great things, and one day you might not need to worry about Grevy zebra conservation, but there might be something else that needs the rangeland. It's important to remember, too, that as the culture shifts in the communities, as people move away from this pastoralist lifestyle and start to put more of an emphasis on sending their kids to school and putting money in banks and seeing a value in more traditional or more Western ways of employment, that their needs as a community are going to change. It's important for Grevy Zebra Trust to stay up to date on what's happening, and they can really use that alumni base that they're creating to do so. As they engage their alumni, as they've decided that they're going to make a club. The club members are going to work in their communities and to spread the information and hold meetings with their peers and then with the elders as well. And this has already started. The field school took place in July, and when we went back to visit Grevy Zebra Trust before we left in September, they had already followed up with the kids and already heard that children were asking their pastors for time after Sunday service to share the message that they had learned at GZT, or asking teachers to take some time at the beginning of their class to tell their classmates the important things that they had learned. Some of the herder children were having meetings among their peers saying, okay, I learned that everything is important, even the little dik-diks, which are the little itty-bitty antelopes, and they suggested to their friends that we can't kill the dik-diks anymore because the young boys, when they got their spears, would go out and practice with the dik-diks. So the herder children went home and said, we can't do this anymore, you guys, and took a bunch of lessons home. Additionally, the elders got together and said, okay, how are we going to support these children? How are we supporting the lessons that Grevy's is teaching? Some of those things came in the form of, well, let's step up our game on conservation projects. And they motioned to remove a bunch of acacia trees in some areas that were being damaged, and the acacias kind of suck everything up out of the ground. That project had happened by the time I went back in August. They had pulled the acacias and set up the gully set it up to hold water and to prevent gullying during the rainy season. These youth are going to be the future leaders. Keeping them engaged as they grow up is going to be key to the success of future conservation projects. So here we've got the value of youth in education, the youth in conservation. Like I've said multiple times, children are our future. They are what's going to make a difference in the future of the world. And these conservation organizations need their buy-in. They need the kids to understand why they're doing the projects they're doing and why those projects matter. It's important also to recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to conservation projects, but that also applies to how you engage kids in conservation. A lot of the literature that exists on conservation education or environmental education is written through a Western lens. It comes from places like Europe, Australia, Canada, here in the US. The programs and projects that we use to engage kids here are radically different than the programs and projects that are going to be used and going to be successful abroad. You have kids living in New York who have never seen trees in the nature. They've never been in a forest. And then you have kids living in Samburu whose daily life is navigating their way through the acacia trees with their goats. Getting kids excited about nature and excited about the world around them isn't going to be the same for those two groups. And that's a huge thing that's important to recognize and remember. Also, the context in which you're engaging the kids is important. As we saw with the Grevy Zebra Trust, there are some styles of learning that worked really well for school children, and there were some styles of learning that worked really well for both. It's important to remember the children you're working with and their background. Are they school children? Do they come from a more rural environment? Do they come from a more developed environment? What's that going to look like, and how do you target those groups? GZT has the honor to be working in the community. They're in it every single day. Their staff comes from the community. They have a good idea of how to work with their kids. But this is an important lesson to take home for anyone who wants to do youth education through conservation, youth engagement in conservation through education abroad. And that was one of the most important lessons I learned. So here in this next section are going to be my musings about Kenya and some of the great things that I learned while I was abroad. Because in addition to having an amazing project partner and an amazing project to work on, I also lived for 4 months in this country. So for this section, it was suggested that I pick a few of my favorite pictures, which for anyone who doesn't know me, I like my camera. I take a lot of pictures. It was a really hard task.
Was it over 5,000?
It was close to. There's not that many pictures in here, though, despite the file size of the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to talk you through kind of my reflection of my time in Kenya, and there are some nice pictures that kind of help capture that. So when I went to Kenya, I was excited beyond all recognition. I had always dreamed of working abroad, of working with communities, and helping in conservation. In fact, shortly before I left for Kenya, I was cleaning out my desk and I found a journal that I had kept from after my senior year of high school while working at a summer camp. During that program, we asked the kids to write down, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10? And I had written down for my 5-year mark, I will go to Africa and I will work with people on conservation issues. I was a year late because 6 years later, I made it to Kenya and I started to work with people on conservation issues. And that, like, having that moment right before I left was like, whoa, you're doing this. You're supposed to be here. So elephants have always been my heart and soul, and I've loved them my whole life. So being in a place where there were elephants was just incredible. Additionally, in our first 2 weeks in the country, we had visited Old Pajeda Conservancy and Samburu National Reserve. Here's the Garanik that I was so excited to see, and that's a picture of a chimp who lives at the Old Pajeda Chimp Sanctuary, which his story just breaks my heart, but that's for another time. While I was in Kenya, I had promised myself that I would experience as much of the country as possible. I've lived and worked in a lot of different locations, and I always find myself leaving those experiences and wishing I had done more, wishing I had spent more time exploring the place I was in and less time worrying about, well, what are we going to do? Let's talk about it. Well, what are we going to do here? What are we going to eat? Et cetera, et cetera. So at every opportunity I had, I jumped on it. I traveled to the coastal city of Watamu, where we visited some ancient Swahili ruins featured in the lower corner, and also visited a community conservation project that was working on mangrove restoration. And that in its own was a really cool experience. It was early enough in my time in Kenya that I was excited to see new conservation programs. I had no idea how much was happening, and this program touted itself as incredibly successful. They were working to conserve the mangroves with the local community. We went on a baboon walk with the cultural village. We did a couple more game drives to that Old Pajeda Conservancy and spent some more time in Samburu. I also had the honor of working with a group of children who didn't participate in the field school during a trial period where we ran through some of the kinks that might need to get worked out in our test. Additionally, I visited Hell's Gate National Park, which is a geothermal park, and had some really incredible opportunities there. There are no big predators left in that park, so you can walk through it or bike through it, and that's just what we did. The hippos and the birds are from the Hell's Gate trip, and up there in the middle, I'm half talking to, half pantomiming to a Samburu elder. She didn't speak much English. I can say like 3 things in Samburu, but she was trying to explain the game that we were playing. And connecting with people in that capacity was just really, really wonderful and really unique. Additionally, because I traveled across the reserve so many times to visit my project partner, I had a chance to get up close and personal with some of the incredible animals that are in Samburu. Oh no! Wait, stop, come back. We're so close. So when this image comes back up, what you guys will see is, come on, you can do it. You can do it. Okay. Sorry, folks. Here we go. So, as we spent some time driving across the reserve, we got up close and personal with some of the animals. That animal in the middle is a greater kudu, and they're quite endangered. They're not very good at defending themselves, and that makes them a really easy target for lions, which, of course, in the bottom, that is a lion. And that was a really cool experience. We were driving down the road, and all of a sudden, there was a car stopped. We're like, what is happening here? And then the camera lens came out of the car in front of us, and we had this moment of, there is something in that bush. So as we pulled up, the lion was probably meter breadth. As I was sitting in the car, very safe with my camera lens, but it was an incredible just moment. When you get an opportunity to look into an animal's eyes, or really into the eyes of anything you're taking a picture of, there's something that speaks to your soul. So this is, additionally, that's Mount Kenya. It's the 2nd tallest mountain in Africa. I hiked up that. It was a really cool experience. Lost both my toenails to that adventure. But it was just one of those things where you're surrounded by endemic plants and everything around you was beautiful. So finally, our last trip that we took as a full cohort to close out our experience was to Maasai Reserve to participate in the viewing of the wildebeest migration. The wildebeest migration played more of a role in my time in Kenya than I thought it would because it became one of the central things to the GZT lesson plans. So here's a couple of my favorite pictures from that adventure as well. And as I close out, I leave you with an elephant walking away. And that picture was one of the last pictures I took while I was in Kenya. And for me, it just kind of summed up this experience of beautiful things and incredible things, and then time to move on to a new adventure. So as I end, I would like to say thank you to so many of the people who made this project possible. The GZT staff was the most amazing to work with, and they were truly incredible. I also have to thank my CLTL cohort, both here stateside for their friendship and their support, and also for the help that they had in the initial stages of this project. I also want to give a shout out to Travis, who was so helpful in data collection and data analysis and instrumental to the success of this project. And then my committee, thank you guys. Thank you, Mordecai, for being here and for your support. And Brett, thank you for being my go-to advisor and for your help on my final project. It's worth noting that the St. Louis Zoo provided the funding for the conservation field school, and as a result, I was able to stay out at GZT for free, which made a huge difference in my experience. So I've got some logos, and I have time for questions. And if anybody is wondering, this is a common zebra, and this is a grevy zebra. So looking at those two pictures, hopefully you can see some of the differences. And that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for being here.